Welcome to Design Downtime, the podcast where we celebrate the joys of living a balanced creative life. I'm your host, Guy Siegel, a design director in Toronto, Canada, and I invite you to join me on this journey as we redefine what it means to be a successful design professional. Let's break free from the shackles of hustle culture and embrace the full spectrum of human experience, because life is too precious to be spent only in pursuit of productivity. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Anne Hjortshøj. Anne has successfully led design as an executive across B2C industries, including automotive, CPG, retail, financial services, and EdTech. She has built design capabilities at 3 organizations, assembling UX teams from the ground up, while scaling the function and advancing a strong, consistent design culture. Welcome to the show, Anne.
Thank you for having me.
And you want to talk to us about fine art?
Yeah. I have sort of let me sort of set the stage. And I'm sure you and anyone else who works in the design industry in tech, a lot of our sort of day-to-day is highly verbal. And it involves a lot of translation from the pictures in our head, whether we are individual contributor designers or leaders who don't touch pixels anymore. A lot of what we do is translation and kind of talking about design, which is not art, with people who are not designers. So we are guiding the way for people who aren't necessarily visual thinkers to think about visual outcomes, and I'm boiling down what design is quite a bit. But that's really how our friends in other roles think about what it is that we do. They may confuse us with artists. We are not. We are creating solutions that adhere to requirements of business and of the medium that we work in. We are not artists. The design that we do is about solving a problem. It is not about communicating an emotion or the way we think about the world or that kind of thing. And our intent is to solve that problem. It is not to communicate something about ourselves. I am really drawn to looking at fine art being art that is created. When I think of the phrase fine art, I think of something in an art history textbook, which is from the Renaissance, which is a very figurative statue or painting. And really what I'm interested in more is contemporary art. And that leads me to things like color fields and geometries and more abstractions versus hardcore figurative art, which I still like looking at. So I'm drawn to, this is a very roundabout way of explaining why I'm drawn to art in the first place. For me, in particular, the way I think is highly visual. I see pictures in my head. I see objects. I think through things logically, visually, in a way that is not verbal. I am also highly verbal. I was an English major in college, so I spend a lot of time kind of going back and forth. When I look at art, I don't have to do that. It's very immediate. And I start to think about, what is the intent of the artist in this case? It's not just a color field or a set of geometries. It is it's wrapped in intent. And it is interesting to contemplate the intent and how that work is talking to or reacting to other things that the artist is thinking about, either their contemporaries in the art world, trends in the art world, that kind of thing. I think between art and design is craft, which sort of straddles both and which is also interesting to me. I see craft as, we have a great local museum in Boston called the Peabody Essex Museum, which is in Salem, which has been around for a long time and was focused on showcasing import objects. Salem was a great center of commerce for a long time, big port city, especially with the so-called China trade. So they have a great collection of Asian arts and crafts that they've then built into something that's comparable to, I would say, a decent pairing with the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, which also focuses on craft. The other thing I really like about art is that it is wound into history. And certainly museums like the V&A and the Peabody Essex have to do that because of how they evolved and what they evolved from. People weren't rich in Salem because they were doing nice things. It was, the triangle trade and benefiting from enslavement of other people in certain cases and the opium wars in China. So it's very interesting. Art enables a lot of visual thinking, and it enables a lot of sort of understanding artistic output in the context of a greater history. It's just incredibly rich, and that's why I like it.
I really appreciate how you started this conversation with defining the terms.
Very design.
And I want to go back to not the first time you meet fine art, but when is that first time where it sort of clicks for you, if it makes sense?
In my life, or
Yes.
when I encounter an object? Oh, in my life. Well, I think because I grew up in an area of the country that was very wired into the past. I grew up in coastal Maine. Essentially, my town was full of old Greek Revival houses mixed in with other things. And in that kind of environment, everything sort of is a house museum. It wasn't like it was totally wealthy or anything. The Maine peaked in about 1860 economically. So there are lots of artifacts of that time kicking around, and nothing really changes there. People stay, the same families have been there for generations and generations. And people hold on to things because there isn't a ton of wealth around to sweep those things away. So that was interesting to me. I think also I grew up next to a library and spent a lot of time there. My parents had a set of, this is sort of funny, Time Life books from the 1960s that covered the entire history of art. And I sat down and read all of it. I was also very involved in music, and that's similarly kind of a nonverbal experience that really appealed to me. So I always liked it. I was always interested in the history of art and very much engaged with visual stuff.
So since your sort of path into fine art is heavily tied into history, are you able to sort of detach fine art from the history?
I don't think so. It's all contextual. I think what people get wrong about art is that it is just a thing on a wall. And that's why I think performance art or conceptual art is very hard for people sometimes. But I think akin to design, art is an artifact of the artist's intent. It is not a freestanding thing. It's kind of like when I studied English in college, the time during which I was in college was sort of the tail end of what's called the new criticism, which is what a lot of people my age grew up with in high school and college, which is the absence of art, of critical theory, really, and saying, well, the thing in itself is complete. You don't really have to place a book in time. And that, I think that was a reaction to prior critical theory that very much aggressively placed books in a particular period and assumed a lot about authorial intent that was incorrect. So I think there's a little bit of that carries over into how people think about art. And I think it's also that there is a lot to know about art. So it's a bit of a gap between people who maybe just don't have the time or the immediate interest and people who are really in it. It can go to a ridiculous extreme. There's so much to know that sometimes people drown in the critique and what they know. It becomes just sort of a game of references, which isn't my favorite. It's a little bit, I would say, gatekeeperish, but I really love the recent trend of museums really connecting what they have to the community and kind of applying a new placing of the thing in context that is more, I think it's better for kind of getting people interested in the art. I think that, and I have a good friend who's an art advisor. I was friends with her before I even delved into my own interest in collecting. But she and I have had these conversations about the role of museums, and museums in the recent past, have been treated like treasure houses. It's where you go to look at the things on the walls and contemplate how many millions of dollars they cost. And it's really not about that. They're only as interesting as their connections to people in some cases. And very seldom is something just sort of this bravura artwork on its own that can be admired in a vacuum. You got to have the context.
So for you, an art piece is incomplete without that context. If it's just, you have to go beyond the visceral aspect of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there is the visceral aspect, but it's much richer if you understand sort of where it's placed and can not only understand what the prevailing take on it is, but how do you feel about it?
So you studied English, literature. Did you get more into fine arts at some point?
I think it's mostly recent, and it really is a reaction to being in design leadership and needing to have some sort of, I guess, palate cleanser for a lot of the swirl of verbalization in my head. Design leadership really isn't about, at a certain level, it's not about having your hands in the designs. It's about quality and measuring against business outcomes. And it's pretty interesting at a logic level, but also dry from a visual one. You're not going to make great art out of an interface. It's going to be measured in, yes, it feels nice, it feels high quality, it is something that feels expensive, but it's not an expression of you. So I think the more I was being a leader in design and having all of my time taken up with this job, the more I needed a palate cleanser. Vivienne Westwood, who's a fashion designer who died fairly recently, she was and design in fashion is half art, it's a craft, but she was very vocal about, you have to go look at art, you have to read books, you have to be connected to the world. You can't be a good designer without it. And I really agree with that, simply because I feel so much better after I go to a museum. It's a nice way to take me out of myself and look at these things that are expressing visual ideas and sometimes words. Art can incorporate words, but it's not in my bubble.
You spoke of the design leader's role in defining and sometimes enforcing quality.
Yeah.
Is there an aspect of quality that you assign to fine art? Is there any sort of a rating system for you in terms of, this is good art, this is bad art?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is in the eye of the beholder, and a lot of it is contextual. Like a series of bricks on a floor can be fine art if you understand why they're there and what they represent. But in general, there needs to be a certain level of craft in art for me to take it seriously as art. Not always. If somebody is working within figurative painting, they should know what they're doing. But that said, I went to an art exhibit last year at the Museum of Fine Art that was a touring exhibit of a guy called Matthew Wong, who is no longer with us. He was a painter, very young painter, who started out, he basically within 11 years, went from zero to a very accomplished and significant artist. He was neurodivergent. He had autism and Tourette's, super talented, super smart. Started as a photographer and then moved into kind of ink painting and referring to Chinese ink painting and scrolls, and then moved quickly toward painting in oils and engaged with the internet pretty heavily. He had an Instagram account that he would just post thousands and thousands of images to as he thought through the work of different artists and what it meant and what he could take from them and how his reactions would be to them, and became an artist, a painter who was very heavily influenced by Klimt and by Van Gogh. And anyway, so really, he wasn't an amazing painter in every respect. Like he managed to gather kind of themes in his paintings that he could execute on, but stunning work, really affecting. Was he an amazing painter on every level? No. He was doing he was doing very specific things, but the way he was engaging with it was amazing.
So is the message of the work of art overcomes the capability of the artist?
Yeah, sometimes. And it's very much like, specific to the beholder. So, yeah, I mean, and there's definitely trends in art. It's so much of it is untethered from any hard evaluation of quality, really. And a lot of it is very specific to people who are gatekeepers in the fine art world. One of the things that's very interesting about fine art to me is that it's such a small industry, and it's very, very, it's got this oppositional relationship to the auction house industry. And a lot of artists are really struggling with that. There is a classic route to success in the art world, which says that you basically go to one of 3 or 4 graduate programs after you get out of art school, and one of them is Yale. And then you have a show, and you may or may not get lifted up to, some level of success by one of the big galleries in New York, and the center of the art world is in New York, somewhat in London, somewhat in LA, mostly New York. And it's super small. And there's a lot of controversy around the auction houses because what happens is these young artists get taken up by the industry, and then their stuff gets sold to collectors, and sometimes the collectors turn around and flip their art to Sotheby's or Phillips or Christie's. And then the value of that art goes up 20 times, and the artist doesn't see any of that. So there's this weird thing that happens with fine art galleries in New York where they don't list any prices, and you need to be introduced, and they need to check you out as a collector. And I don't collect on that level, but I know about it. There's a great book called The $12 Million Stuffed Shark, The Curious Economics of Contemporary Art by Don Thompson, published in 2008, that I recommend to anyone who's interested in this. It's yet another way of getting to know this weird world and some of the strange things that go on in it, while also understanding, like, who do you see in museums, and who are these anonymous people who are putting their stuff in museums? Sometimes they're people that want to create value for an object by shunting it through a museum exhibit, and sometimes those people are the artists themselves. So it's very interesting. Anyway, sort of a tangent.
You mentioned in the beginning that you, as far as I understand it, you started from looking at figurative art and then getting into more contemporary works. Tell me about that shift for you.
I think I just had a better vocabulary at some point to kind of be okay with non-figurative contemporary art. I think it's just sort of a natural human thing. Art has been held up to be, over time, very figurative, and the Impressionists happened and disrupted that, and then abstract expressionism happened and disrupted other things. Yeah, it's always been a kind of a pendulum swing. I think that it takes education to develop a taste in certain things. It's like educating your palate if you like food.
Before I dive deeper into contemporary art for you, I'm curious to know, so those works of art from the 17th, 18th century, do you still feel that they have something to say for us today?
Yeah, absolutely. Why not? I mean, I don't necessarily want that in my house, but it's high artistry, certainly high craft. And they were I think the art history element really wraps that. And you can see, okay, this was actually pretty radical for the time. Like Degas was completely radical for the time because of the people that he drew and painted and created sculptures of. These were not people that were going to, like, ballet was not a high-end art. It was essentially burlesque at that point. And the ballet dancers were not treated well or seen to be much of anything. And yet he was creating statues of them and exhibiting them. And it was very controversial. So, I mean, the Renaissance, similar, right? So it was about not making religious art for a change in many cases, or treading that line. Very interesting. I think one thing that's interesting now is that figurative artists aren't taken necessarily as seriously in the 21st century because it's seen as kind of conservative, but it really depends on how it's done. It's a conversation, right? It's not about just the piece. So it has to be in context.
So what are some of the sort of more contemporary works or artists that you find yourself drawn to?
A lot of I'm interested in, put it this way, we went to the Whitney Biennial a couple weeks ago in New York, my husband and I, and I am not what I would call an art expert by any means. When you get into this, you understand how little you know, and it's just a hobby, really. But so the Whitney Biennial is a survey of contemporary American art. It happens every couple of years. It's put on by the Whitney Museum in New York City. The work there is aggressively contemporary. I mean, there's paintings, there's sculptures, but there's also conceptual art, The thing that was really striking there was there is an artist named Isaac Julian who had an installation which was a dark room, and it was called Once Again, Statues Never Die. And it was sort of a bunch of different floor-to-ceiling screens with video playing on them all at once, different focus things happening on different screens, African statues on plinths that were sort of shot through with plastic. The piece addresses, and I have notes here because there's no way I could pull this out of my memory, just so people know. So basically, it reflects on the life and thought of Alain, or Alain, Alain Locke, I don't know how he pronounced it, philosopher, educator, and cultural critic of the Harlem Renaissance, played by Andre Holland, who urged members of the African diaspora to embrace African art in order to reclaim their cultural heritage. So there are different sculptures in the exhibit that are encased in plastic that are from actual artists. They're not recreated by the artist who did this. He's making a visual and sonic meditation as a diasporic dream space. And it's set at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, which is kind of an old style museum, which is more of a treasure house of stuff that's been brought back from all over the planet and kind of in very densely populated glass cases with really interesting architecture from the 19th century. So it was visually gorgeous. It asked all kinds of questions. The actor who played the philosopher, the Black philosopher, was speaking to an actor playing the founder of the Barnes Collection in Philadelphia, who knew Locke, and they were debating who gets to define essentially Black modernism, who has the authority to speak, how do men negotiate power and queer desire. So that was really fascinating and very successful. Like, I got all of that from that experience. It was very obvious, not in a bad way. It was well done. I think there were some other contemporary conceptual pieces that were less successful there, but that was really striking. There's a guy named Eamon Orgueron, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name correctly, who's just a straight up painter. And he had a couple of pieces there. They're sort of abstract. I would describe them as geometric. He was born in Tucson, Arizona in the 70s, lives in LA now. And his stuff is very Arizona in that it's like pastel geometric. There's some faces in there that look like kind of Zuni doll-ish. There's shapes in there that are very Southwestern, but really dynamic and gorgeous and striking, and you feel it when you look at it. Very cool stuff. So it's sort of a spectrum there. Really fun.
Does all this ever give you the desire to create art yourself?
I mean, I've done photography in the past. It's a full-time endeavor. And I think I would need to start from going to art school, honestly. And I don't think I have it in me, honestly. I'm a good designer. I'm very good at interior design. I'm a decent photographer. I would have to go to school for it and really engage.
I'm really shying away from ever talking about, how these areas of interest for people tie into their life as a designer, because I want to keep it on the human level. I'm wondering what sort of misconceptions about fine art you come across.
Well, I mean, I think people think it's really elitist. And honestly, it's been used that way because some of the barrier to, I think people see what's in museums and think, oh, it's just millions of dollars. This is not for me. This is a backdrop for a donor's dinner. It's nothing I could really engage with. But I think that what people forget is that artists are radicals, and they did not make these things necessarily with the intent of them being kind of fetishized as piles of money. And that's not really where they were coming from. These people were driven to create, and that's how it should be seen. Now, I mean, you will get artists who are in the business for money. Of course, they want to make money. They need to live. They want to live well. Who doesn't? But I think also once you sort of change your point of view from, well, going to the museum is us looking at the expensive treasure house, to I'm going to the museum to engage with objects and really see what it does to my brain. Then you start thinking of different ways of engaging with art. Like, there are local artists in Boston who are amazing, and you can collect from them in media that are cheaper. So a lot of artists have so-called works on paper. Really famous artists will work on paper just to create things more quickly in a more accessible way. And that might be, and I'm not talking about giclée print reproductions. I'm talking about things like sketches or ink paintings or, sculptors who will create ink paintings, that kind of thing. I had a name. I think Richard Serra did a bunch of, he was the one who did Tilted Arc, big metal thing, blocked off a square in New York very famously in the 80s. And he also did a bunch of ink paintings that were pretty cool and much cheaper for his collectors, much easier to store, easier to ship, that kind of thing. So, I think the joke in the fine art dealing world is, these people who collect works on paper, blah, blah, blah. But they're really great. Very easy. You can collect people who are local artists who never exhibit in New York City. Just develop your own eye. It's really cool. Go to open studios. It's not a high-end pursuit, or doesn't have to be,
Yeah, absolutely. Anne, where can people find you?
They can find me on LinkedIn right now. I think ANNEHJ is the part of the URL you can type in because my name is difficult. I'm also at ANNEHJ.com. I'm on Blue Sky and on Mastodon under Ansaurus, ANNESAURUS.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
This is all for this episode of Design Downtime. Thank you for joining me. And until next time, I hope you enjoy your downtime.